the history of law enforcement and the history of white supremacy are very much entwined, not only in those two instances, but if you think about all of the ways in which white supremacy historically has been maintained: slave patrols, that was law enforcement; black codes, that was law enforcement; segregation enforced by law enforcement; fugitive slave laws, that was law enforcement; the killing of 27 members of the Black Panther Party by police, including but not limited to Mark Clark and Fred Hampton in their beds while they slept in Chicago, law enforcement; the bombing of the row houses in which MOVE family and organizational members lived in Philadelphia in 1985, in which about a dozen individuals, including half a dozen children, were killed. Law enforcement, that history about which we're often not taught, shapes the way in which people of color come to understand law enforcement in America, and it shapes, therefore, the way that they understand things like the killing of Mike Brown.
What's up, YouTube family? Welcome back to my space. This is Evans Rayola. Guys, thank you so much for tuning to watch this video. I do not take your support for granted. So guys, on today's video, we want to talk about racism, white denial, and criminal justice in the US. And when we talk about criminal justice, the first things that comes to my mind is the law enforcement, against the black people in the US. So guys, I want us to dive deeper into this conversation and get to learn together. To speak to us today is Tim Wise, who's a prominent anti-racism activist and writer who has spoken extensively about racism, white denial, and the criminal justice system. His work focuses on exposing the systemic nature of racial inequality and challenging the myths that uphold white privilege. So guys, I wanted to watch this video of Tim Wise. Once the video is done, we'll get back and do a critical analysis about the same. Let's watch this, guys.
I know that I was here in '08, right before the presidential election. And, I guess like most people, I was just, totally convinced that, after the presidential election, we wouldn't have to have these conversations about racism anymore. But surprise, it didn't really work out that way. I'm sure you're all shocked by that, as I am. I was thoroughly expecting to go in a totally different career direction after the election of a man of color, because we all know that the election of a man of color in a country founded on racism and white supremacy does, by definition, signify the death of white supremacy. I'm sure you all know that, just like that the election of a woman as head of state in Pakistan, Israel, India, Great Britain, the Philippines, and Ireland means that patriarchy and misogyny have been utterly eradicated from those nations forever, and that women there now have fully equal opportunity with their male counterparts. Did you not get that memo? I suggest that maybe you didn't, but that would be the logical corollary of what a lot of people would have us believe in this country. So I guess what we're learning, if nothing else, since 2008, is that all fantasies of post-raciality aside, we still have quite a bit of work to do. And it's important to understand just how much work we have left to finish here in this country when it comes to issues of racial equity. And it's important for us to talk about that right now, because we're in this sort of strange historical moment. And by that, I'm referring to the fact that, this year, as you know, is sort of a commemorative year. We've been in a commemorative mode with regard to race for a couple of years now, for obvious historical reasons, right? This is the 50th anniversary of the Selma to Montgomery March, as you may well know, particularly if you've seen the film Selma. If you haven't, you should see it. It's a fabulous film. But in any event, the 50th anniversary of the Selma to Montgomery March, the 50th anniversary, therefore, of the Voting Rights Act, which came shortly after that. Last year was the 50th anniversary of the Civil Rights Act. The year before that was the 50th anniversary of the Birmingham campaign, the March on Washington, the murder of Medgar Evers in Jackson, Mississippi, George Wallace standing in the schoolhouse door at the University of Alabama pledging segregation now, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever. So the last couple of years have been years in which we have been able, and we have been very quick, I think, as a country, to look back in time and to talk about these monumentous events. And by the way, I'm not saying that these events are not, these incredible momentous things are not important. We should commemorate them. I think that's valuable. Commemoration serves a purpose. Remembering serves a purpose. And an awful lot of people fought and died to get us where we are today. So we have to recall what they did and why. However, having said that, I think that we can also agree, at least I hope we can, that sometimes when we are locked in commemoration mode, right, we end up freezing ourselves in time with a constant glance that looks backward at all of the ground that we have covered as a nation, not looking ahead at all the ground that remains to be covered. We look back And we say almost by definition, look how far we've come. My God, isn't that amazing? You know, it's sort of how we teach history in this country, particularly in high school, middle school, right? Unless you had a really incredible history teacher and went to a really quite spectacular school, the odds are you, like me, you know, we were all taught history in a very linear kind of way, right? Which is to say, oh, once upon a time there was this thing called slavery, but some really good people got together and got rid of it. Thank God for that. And then there was this thing called segregation, but then some really good people got together and got rid of that too. And we're always making progress. We're always moving onward and upward and forward in a linear progression, so that things were bad, now they're better, tomorrow they'll be even better, as if it was just the turning of the hands on the clock or the changing of the pages on a calendar that made that true, as opposed to the committed acts of advocates and activists and people willing to risk their lives. So when we're in commemoration mode, sometimes we're so focused on the ground that we've covered that we ignore how much remains. It's sort of like going on a road trip from the tip of Maine to San Diego, right? If you were to do that as a child with your parents, right? Your parents, by the time they got to Kansas, they'd be like, wow, can you believe how far we've come? And if you're the kid in the back seat, you're like, yeah, but are we there yet? And when the hell are we going to get to San Diego? You're not really impressed with how far you've come, because young people are not impressed with retrospective. Young people are not really impressed with commemoration. Young people have too much living to do and too much on the line to talk about how bad things used to be in relation to now. They want to know, when are they going to be better in relation to now? Because that's the thing about youth. Youth is impatient, and thank God for that. It was young people impatient enough to lead that work in the 1960s, when older folk were willing to sit back and look back and say how much better things were than they were in the 30s, you see? Older folk are always willing to do commemoration. I say that as somebody who's older myself. It's real easy for us because we can pat ourselves on the back and talk about how much we've done, but young folk don't care. And right now, these young folk who are leading this post-Ferguson movement, this Black Lives Matter movement, trying to raise attention to the racist over-policing and militarization of police in black and brown space, are doing us all an incredible favor by reminding us that even as we can enjoy a film like Selma for what it says both artistically and historically, we have got work to do. And we can't get trapped in this mode of hero worship of those who have been gone now for a very long time, even as we respect them and even as we guard their memory and guard their legacy, unless we connect to that legacy, unless we decide to move that legacy forward to that next level, then all we're doing is remembering, and we're not really involved in the work. And it's especially important for us, I would suggest, to think about that civil rights movement that we remember now, 50 years later, roughly, since the height of that movement and the Selma to Montgomery March. It is perfectly appropriate for us to remember that the one arena of American life that went largely untouched by that movement was the one that we're here to talk about tonight. All right? So the civil rights movement focused its attention, and, you know, understandably so. I'm not saying this as a criticism. I'm just saying it as an observation. Understandably so, on segregation in education, discrimination in the job market, discrimination in public accommodations, in voting, and in housing. Those were the primary arenas in which the movement did its work and about which it spoke. Criminal justice and reforming the police were, although certainly talked about and certainly instrumental and key to the political agenda of Black Power movements in the late 1960s, they were largely absent from the advocacy-based, public policy-based aspect of the civil rights struggle in the early 60s that we commemorate now, a half a century later. And having not really talked about that, having not really focused their attention on that, it ought not surprise us that a half century later we haven't made nearly as much progress in that area, and in fact perhaps have gone backwards relative to a few others where, although the gaps have closed far too slowly, they have closed at least a bit. You know, we certainly have seen progress in certain areas, but in this area, virtually none. In fact, regress. In 1964, for instance, 2 out of 3 people locked up in this country were white, and only 1/3 were people of color. By 1994, those numbers had flipped, and by then, and still today, 2/3 of all people incarcerated in this country are people of color, and only 1/3 are white. This is not because white people in 1965 woke up from a deep criminal slumber and said to ourselves, oh my God, we've been committing all this crime. We should probably stop. Don't you think? Like, we should stop that. It's awful. And then black folks, I suppose, according to this theory, looked around and saw that white folks were retiring from crime and said, well, now hell, if they're not going to do it, maybe we should just do it. Somebody's got to do crime. That's not what happened, right? The share of crime committed by black folk as a share of overall crime did not statistically significantly budge in that period. The share of crime done by white folk in that period did not statistically significantly budge, but where we put our criminal justice resources did. And so we begin to see that shift in the immediate aftermath of the passage of this great civil rights legislation, suggesting that this is one arena left largely untouched and thereby allowed to backslide, to get actually worse rather than better. And what's ironic about that is that the criminal justice system was largely ignored by the dominant strand of the civil rights struggle, even as law enforcement has been always and forever a central fulcrum of racism in the United States, a central key lever of white supremacy. So that, for instance, even by the 1930s, half of all African Americans who were killed by whites in those days were killed by white law enforcement, and the other half were almost always killed with the collaboration and the silence and the participation indirectly of law enforcement. In 1917, the worst of all race riots possibly in this country's history took place. There were race riots every year in the first 30 to 40 years of the 20th century, but in 1917, one in particular in which law enforcement actively participated in East St. Louis, Illinois, not all that far from Ferguson, Missouri, on the other side of the river. In that particular riot, 150 individuals were killed, African American folks killed, 35 children killed, their bodies thrown into bonfires, their skulls crushed against rocks by police and civilians who acted under the cover of police. And so these kinds of stories, whether we're talking about the way in which cops actively participated in the murder of black people or sat back and watched as other white, quote unquote, civilians did so in these race riots, it is important for us to acknowledge those things, because that history suggests to us that the history of law enforcement and the history of white supremacy are very much entwined, not only in those two instances, but if you think about all of the ways in which white supremacy historically has been maintained. Slave patrols, that was law enforcement. Black codes, that was law enforcement. Segregation enforced by law enforcement. Fugitive slave laws, that was law enforcement. The killing of 27 members of the Black Panther Party by police, including but not limited to Mark Clark and Fred Hampton in their beds while they slept in Chicago. Law enforcement, the bombing of the row houses in which MOVE family and organizational members lived in Philadelphia in 1985, in which about a dozen individuals, including half a dozen children, were killed. Law enforcement, that history about which we're often not taught, shapes the way in which people of color come to understand law enforcement in America, and it shapes, therefore, the way that they understand things like the killing of Mike Brown, like the killing of Eric Garner, like the killing of Tamir Rice, like the killing of Amadou Diallo, like the killing of Rekia Boyd, like the killing of Katherine Johnston, like the killing of one after another man and or woman of color, disproportionately targeted by law enforcement. Those to black and brown people cannot be seen as isolated incidents because they take place against a backdrop of decades and generations and centuries of law enforcement abuse against black and brown bodies. So while we as white folks often look at these things as individual, and we assume that we have to assess them all as individual, isolated cases, it is impossible for a community that has felt and has been targeted by this institution to view them in that particular way, especially when today we know that every week there are 2 black men and or women who are being killed unarmed by law enforcement or wannabe law enforcement, people like George Zimmerman. Right? Speaking of whom, for those who believed George Zimmerman's version of what happened that night when he came upon Trayvon Martin, you might want to reflect on what it means that this individual who supposedly insisted to us that Trayvon was the violent one, Trayvon was the aggressor, Trayvon was the one who was dangerous, this individual, very much unlike Trayvon, who did not have a record of assault and battery, did not have a violent criminal history. This individual, since getting out of jail, has now been arrested 3 times for domestic battery, 3 times for violent and unhinged actions, But we believed him as a country. So many white folks did, according to the surveys, because it is easier, is it not, to believe that Trayvon Martin is a dangerous individual than to believe that George Zimmerman may have been acting on the basis of his own internalized biases against black males. So just keep that in mind. 2 a week. And black males 21 times more likely to be killed by law enforcement than white males. It is not because they are 21 times more likely to commit crime. That is certainly not the case. It is not because they are 21 times more likely to act aggressively toward police. In fact, what evidence we have suggests either that there is no difference in the aggressiveness that is exhibited by white males versus black males when they encounter police, or that if anything, black males are less likely to be aggressive toward police when confronted by them, because they know full well that if they do, they will die. They will cease to be carbon-based life forms. And yet they are still 21 times more likely to be killed in spite of that fact. So black folks and brown folk can't ignore this the way that some of us in the white community have been able to do. They have to think about this as a pattern. And once you have enough so-called isolated incidents, it becomes a pattern. It becomes a social problem. It tells you something about your culture. The biggest problem here, though, is that white America, by and large, with exceptions duly noted. So if I'm not speaking in a way that applies to you, you don't have to get defensive, Buttercup. White America, by and large, does not see this thing about which I speak. They do not know of this history that I just recited to you in short form version. They do not appreciate the depth of that history. And how do I know that? Well, because I'm paying very close attention to what so many white folks say every time one of these instances happens, and they happen with alarming regularity, as you know, as of late. Every time that an officer in this country kills an unarmed black male, the first thing that it seems so many white Americans default to is to ask the following question. Well, what did he do to provoke them? I want you to think for a minute about what that question suggests. We only ask this question of individuals who are marginalized and oppressed when they are injured. We want to know what they did. We do this with black folks when they're killed by cops. We do this with women as women when they're the victims of sexual assault. We do this with our LGBT brothers and sisters when they're bashed on the streets. Whenever you're a member of a marginalized group and something happens to you, we want to know what you did. If you're a member of a dominant group, we don't ask that question. We just assume something horrible must have happened in most cases. But when it's someone who's black, we say, what did they do to provoke the police? I don't know. What did Amadou Diallo do? Except be black. Because when he was set upon by the New York Police Department Street Crimes Unit in 1999, all he did was reach for his keys and his wallet because he was trying to get into his own apartment in the vestibule of his own home in New York City. The cops rolled up on him, jumped out of the car, didn't identify themselves as police, didn't have police uniforms on, drew their guns, pointed them at him. He was horrified. He was scared. He was trying to put his hands up, trying to get his wallet out. I guess maybe thinking he was going to be robbed. So here, take my wallet. No, we'll just shoot you 41 times instead. How about that? But we won't go to jail for it. What did Amadou Diallo do? Nothing except be black. What did Eric Garner do to justify being strangled on the streets of Staten Island? Well, according to the story, he was selling loose cigarettes on the street. 2 important points. Number 1, no loose cigarettes were found on his body when they took him to the morgue. So he must have had a real good day selling all those cigarettes, because he didn't have any left. But secondly, and perhaps more importantly, selling loose cigarettes, last time I checked, even on Staten Island is not an offense that is punishable by death. Though there might be folks on Staten Island who wish that it was, because that's sort of the way that that particular borough rolls. But so here's a guy, all he did was be black, and then he mouthed off to cops, which, by the way, is not illegal. It may not be advisable. I don't advise you to do it. And I especially don't advise you to do it if you're black. I'm just saying, don't do it. Probably not a good move. But it is not against the law. And so when he told them, this stops today, y'all always harassing me, this stops today, enough of this, I'm tired of it. That was enough for this particular officer to say, no, to hell with it. You're not tired of it, and we're not stopping today. I'm going to put my arm around your throat. I'm going to compress your jugular vein so that the blood that has made it to your head can't leave your head, can't continue to circulate throughout your body, and you will now die. And he, too, not indicted. What did Eric Garner do to justify that? to bring about that action? Absolutely nothing at all. You can watch the video yourself, although apparently video footage doesn't mean anything to grand juries in Staten Island who cannot see what the rest of us can with our own eyes. What did Tamir Rice in Cleveland do? 12-year-old child, shot dead by a police department which has been critiqued by the Justice Department as one of the most corrupt, brutal, violent, and incompetent when it comes to these particular kind of cases, police departments in the United States. Unbelievable, the level of depravity in this particular department. But here in this case, you have a 12-year-old child playing with a toy gun in a park. And somebody calls the police and says, there's this guy playing with a gun. I think it's probably a toy. No big deal. And he looks like a juvenile. No big deal. But just wanted to give you a heads up. Maybe you drive around and see. So the caller wasn't even that freaked out about it. Caller wasn't, that exorcised about it. He wasn't that concerned that this was a real gun, right? But the dispatcher didn't tell the officers that they thought it was a toy or that it was a kid. So the officers roll up. Now, their first version of the story, and you can watch the video on this too, if you have the stomach for it. They said, well, we told him to drop his weapon 3 times. And then he took it out of his waistband and pointed it at us. So we had no choice but to shoot him, because we thought the gun was real, and we told him, and he didn't follow orders. He didn't respect authority, except now, see, they didn't know there was a video. Oh, sorry. So you can watch the tape, and you see the car pull up, and in less than 2 seconds, Tamir Rice has been shot and is bleeding out on the ground. They didn't ask him 3 times to drop his weapon. They didn't have time to do that. They likely didn't ask him even once. They got out and they shot him. And by the way, he didn't reach for his weapon. He didn't pull his weapon. Hell, he didn't reach for his toy. He didn't pull his toy, and he didn't point his toy at any cop. But the cop that dropped him, who a year and a half earlier had been found mentally unstable to be a police officer, but they let him be one anyway. They certainly didn't care, did they? Didn't care that he was mentally incompetent, didn't care that he was unstable, didn't care that he had failed one after another test in a previous police department, right, and had been let go from that department for that reason. So they killed Tamir Rice. He's bleeding out. His sister runs toward him to try to offer some comfort to her brother. They take her and throw her in the back of a police car, won't let her see him. This is what criminal justice looks like in 2015 in this country. And we'll see whether or not that officer is indicted, but I'll tell you what, if he isn't, the city of Cleveland had damn well better be made ungovernable by protests. That's what it will deserve, and that's what it will richly receive if those young folks leading this struggle have anything to say about it, and if those of us in this room who care enough have anything to say about it. So Tamir Rice didn't do anything but be black, playing with a toy gun, something that, hell, white men run around with real guns in the state of Ohio, because it's an open carry state, y'all. So it's legal. You can walk around with a damn assault rifle on your shoulder. As long as you're white, they won't mess with you.
Family, there's one thing that I find so special about Tim Wise, having to discuss issues that is not affecting his race, but rather affecting the black population in the US. Tim Wise has taken his time, to try and preach against racism, segregation, and all these SMs, that are against the black folk. For that, I respect Tim Wise so much, because rarely does that happen. Fighting for other people's needs. You're okay, but you want to fight for a certain group of people. That to me is so special. Big up to Tim Wise and his works, even as he tries, to ensure that black folks just regain where they're supposed to be in the country, in America. So Tim Wise says that after the election of a man of color, he knew that he wouldn't be rather lecturing about racism again, but nothing has really changed, since Obama was elected as president. Many people knew that if a person of color is elected, it would be easier for change to be in the US. Some people thought that would be the end of racism, that would be the end of segregation, that black people will finally be respected. They thought that President Obama would actually change, the US. Everyone felt the same. Even in Africa, everyone was happy. For the first time, you're having a colored man, a black man to be the president of the United States of America. We knew it was just the end, of racism. Then He says that I thought the election of a man of color in the nation founded by white supremacy would mean the end to white supremacy. You know, a nation founded on white supremacy. If that nation decides to elect a black man, everyone thought that it's also the end to white supremacy, not only the end to racism, but the end to white supremacy as a whole. Then he proceeds to say that the youths in America are impatient, and that impresses him a lot. You know, they don't want to know the struggle of the past, but want a solution to the problems they are facing now. You know, the youths do not want to hear about what the struggle has been since the time immemorial. They want to know the problems that they're having right now. What are the solutions? Is it racism? What's the solution to racism? Is it segregation? You know, they do not want it. They want a quick solution to the same. And he proceeds to say that young folks leading the post-Ferguson movement, the Black Lives Matter movement, trying to raise attention over racism, over policing, militarization of police in black and brown spaces. You know, he says that the young people right now in the US do not want to know about the history. What they want is a solution, a steadfast solution to the problems they are facing. You know, and he commends them so much. Remember, guys, this is a white man trying to gas up, you know, young black people who are trying to fight for their rights. That is just so special about him. Wise. He proceeds to say that in 1964, 2/3 of the people locked up in this country were white, and only a third were people of color. And by 1994, until the time that video was done, the numbers are now opposite. You know, black folks are tending to be in prison more than whites. The criminal justice system was largely ignored by the dominant strand of the civil rights struggle, even as law enforcement has been always and forever a central key of racism and white supremacy in the United States. Law enforcement is working against the black folks in the US. And family, that is so sad. You know, why is it that law enforcement has always been against the black man? What is this that the white supremacist is fearing? You know, that the white man, the black man is privileged over him. Why are they afraid? Why are they using laws? You know, why is America's government using laws through enforcement to try and demean black people, to make it hard for black folks, to imprison them? Black folks are shot dead in cold blood, you know, innocent people who are even not armed. What is this that the white supremacist fears about black men and women? Family, let's think about this deeper. It's time that we come together as a people. It's time that we provide opportunities for our fellow black brothers and sisters. You know, it's time that we do support each other. It's time that we stand together. The criminal justice system has largely ignored by the dominant strand of civil rights struggle, even as law enforcement has been always and forever a central key to racism and white supremacy. The history of law enforcement in the US is just so sad. You know, the history of law enforcement since the days of slavery, man, is so sad. If you look at all the ways white supremacy has been historically maintained, it has always been through law enforcement. Any way that white supremacy has been pushed in the US has always been through law enforcement. Family, how do we get through these as a people if the law is always against us? And he proceeds to give examples on how law enforcement, you know, has been disadvantageous to the black man. He says number 1 is the slave patrols, you remember them. Number 2, segregation. Number 3, the killing of the 27 members of the Black Panther Party by police. The fugitive slave laws, the bombing of the real houses in which Move family and organization members lived in 1985. That history shapes the way in which people of color come to understand law enforcement in America, and it shapes therefore the way that they understand things like the killing of Amadou Diallo. You know, the history of law enforcement in America just makes us understand law enforcement differently. You know, it shapes the way we understand law enforcement. Look at the killings of George Floyd, Amadou Diallo. You know, these things reminds us a lot as black people. We are reminded that we should be we should look at our back, you know, whenever we are walking. We should drive, trying to be keen, you know, because we can easily be gunned down. You know, it tells us that law enforcement in the US is against us. So we should work so hard. We should move around with a lot of fear, because we know that these systems are against us. And family, that is not fair. And I feel the only way that you can be able to get through to things like this is by us uniting as a people. I really like the work of Tim Wise, because this guy speaks nothing but the truth. He's trying to fight for us. You know, he's trying to fight for a race that is not his. He has a lot of love in him. Mad respect. Much respect, actually, to Tim Wise for his incredible work when it comes to just trying, to ensure that black people are restored as a people. Family, I went further to do more research, in regards to the teachings of Tim Wise about the criminal justice system, and here's what I found. Number one, racial disparities in policing and sentencing. Wise has spoken about the disproportionate targeting of black and brown communities by law enforcement. He highlights racial profiling, harsher sentencing for people of color, and the war on drugs as contributors to systemic injustices. Then his number two is a mass incarceration, where Wise draws attention to the overrepresentation of black and Latino individuals in prisons, which he attributed to systemic racism in the legal system. He points out how policies like mandatory minimum sentences and stop and frisk disappropriately impact communities of color. Then number three is the role of the white perception, where he critiques how the media and society portrays crime differently depending on the race of the perpetrator. For example, white perpetrators are often individualized, while black individuals are portrayed as representatives of a larger criminal culture. You see how disadvantaged we are as a people. We are disadvantaged because of our color. These must come to an end. Then here's the call to action. Wise urges that confronting racism requires white people to acknowledge their privilege and actively work to dismantle it. He also challenges other white people to deny systemic racism. Last but not least, he advocates for support policies that addresses racial inequalities, such as criminal injustice reform, education equity, and economic justice. Guys, let me know what you think about this video in the comment box down below. Thank you so much for tuning to watch this video. I do not take your support for granted. Kindly share the video with your friends and family, and I'll be so appreciative. In the same time, comment down below, let me know what you think about this video. You can as well subscribe to the channel so that we may be able to grow as a people and try and spread the gospel of our history as black people and the revolution that all black men and women want for us. Thank you guys, and see you all in my next episode. Goodbye for now.